Hi.
Good morning from Toronto. It's yucky here.
Lovely day in New York.
All right, well, should I make you all jealous? It's sunny and high 60s today.
I'll
Nice.
be out there this
And we
afternoon.
think it's cold because the morning, you see, it was raining and it was like low 60s, right? So we just have a whole different, frame of reference here in Israel.
Yeah,
Because we're in the Holy Land.
Absolutely.
Okay, Vanessa, I see that you managed to connect. Vanessa?
Yes, finally, thank you.
Yeah, there was the Israel, I don't run these meetings. They're through Israel 365. So all the technical stuff they take care of.
Yeah.
So
I know
they
exactly what you say.
they just weren't on top of it today, but that's okay. It's fine.
As long as I
Okay.
can, it's fine.
So let's get started. Okay, now I have to say that this is one of my favorite Torah portions. We're doing the Torah portion of Vayigash, and it really is one of my favorite Torah portions. Of course, we're in the middle of the story of Joseph, and we've reached an unbelievable climax because at the end of last week's portion, we have Joseph really, playing with his brothers, even torturing him to some degree, not physically, of course, but he has framed Benjamin, and he is now saying that Benjamin has to stay in prison and all the rest of them can go back. And they said, no, the brothers, of course, are trying to get out of it. And we see Judah has already started to play a prominent role. At the end of last week's Torah portion in verse 14, chapter 44, verse 14, we have, and Judah and his brothers returned to the house of Joseph. So we have already singled out Judah as one who is assuming a leadership role. And what we're going to follow in this week's portion is really the development of Judah. We saw him, a few weeks ago, and the part he was playing in the sale of Joseph when he didn't want to kill him. He wanted to sell him. There was already some kind of suggestion that he was putting forward, but I can't actually point to anything that he did at that point that reflected leadership qualities. What we did see is in his little encounter with Tamar and that whole situation, on the one hand, he was running away from the guilt and from what was going on. But at the same time, he did step up and take responsibility in the incidents of Tamar. He took responsibility for the fact that her whole situation was his fault. So we began to see a development of Judah. And in this week's Torah portion, we see now as all the brothers are faced with this terrible dilemma. Joseph is saying, you can all go free, except I am going to keep Benjamin here in jail because, of course, he has framed him and he is accusing him, supposedly, of stealing vessels and the silver from Joseph, from the house of Pharaoh. And here Judah steps up. And this is how the Torah portion begins. Vayigash elav Yehuda. Judah approached him. Okay, so just the very choice of the word Vayigash, he approached him. Okay, is very interesting because on the one hand, it's showing that Judah takes responsibility. He takes that leadership role. It is all the brothers standing there in front of Joseph. Any one of them at that point could have said something, did something, but it is Judah that steps up. Literally, he steps up to the plate. But the way the word he approaches him, and you'll see as we read some of the language here in his actual speech, his speech is just a beauty. It is such a brilliantly constructed speech where he has this balance between giving tremendous respect and honor to Joseph as the second to Pharaoh, even to being obsequious, tremendous respect and deference to Joseph on the one hand, and on the other hand, he is not afraid to put forward his case. So let's see how, so first of all, so you have that in that word, he approached him. He approached him, he's looking for approachability. And you'll see in some of the things he says, he is also reaching out to Joseph as a human being. But at the same time, he's going to put forward his case in the strongest way he knows how. So he starts out by saying, Bi Adoni, please my Lord. You have tremendous deference, okay? And then we'll look at verse 20, okay? Verse 20, he's reminding Joseph, he's basically referring to Joseph back the series of conversations that they had over the last few meetings. We told my Lord, again, my Lord, always that deference. We have an old father, and there's a child of his old age, the youngest. His full brother is dead. And literally it says here, his full brother is dead so that he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him. What Judah now is recognizing is the fact that what was the problem all along? The problem all along innocently from the point at which Rachel didn't have children, and Rachel was the beloved wife of Jacob. From that time until this moment on, the problem was that Jacob loved Rachel and that Joseph was his favorite, and everything now that the brothers are representing to Joseph is the fact that now that Joseph is gone, Benjamin is now the favorite because it's the only remaining son of that mother. Now, in Judah's speech here, it doesn't say of the favorite mother, but he says the only remaining son of his mother, of the mother of that missing brother, okay? The only remaining son, and he said that his father loves him. He was able to put forth and recognize that, yes, his father played favorites. His father loved Rachel more, his father loved Joseph more, and now his father loves Benjamin more. But instead of coming at it from a place of jealousy and resentment and even hatred, now he's coming at it as from a place of tremendous sympathy and concern for his father and what would happen to Jacob should Benjamin be locked up in jail in Egypt. So that in and of itself shows an incredible lesson that is learned and an incredible development in Judah himself in being able to admit this and articulate it. Then we go on, verses 27 through 31. He tells the story of mostly he's focusing actually on Jacob's tragedy, and he's fleshing this out. He's saying in verse 27, your servant my father said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one born for me. So he's repeating this again, but in the name of Jacob. Okay. On the one hand, this indicates amazing chutzpah, audacity. He's going and telling the king of Egypt a personal story about his father and how his father feels. Like normally, you would start bringing perhaps legal claims, or you talk about justice, but really the sob story about his father. And yet you see here that at the same time that Judah is showing deference to Joseph as a king, he is also trying to appeal to him for human understanding. He, of course, doesn't know it's Joseph, but he knows that he's a human being. There isn't a king that isn't also a man, and therefore, this is where he's appealing. And then we see in verse 32 through 34, expressions of the fact that Judah is not only stating elements of responsibility, but he's really willing to make the sacrifices that go with taking that responsibility. In verse 32, now your servant has pledged, I would say more than pledged, your servant has taken responsibility, has become a guarantor, okay, has guaranteed the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. So here he's not only recounting the fact that he pledged to his father, he doesn't want to go back on his promise to bring back Benjamin, but now he's taking responsibility to the fullest, and he's saying, take me instead. I will sit in jail and Benjamin will go free, which is the ultimate at taking personal responsibility. And of course, he ends really with a completely personal human plea. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. Oh, let me go. I'm sorry, I've read that one already. This last verse. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father. This is a pure and simple emotional plea to Joseph. And of course it works. But it works, of course, because he is Joseph. And he is completely, he cannot control his emotions anymore. And of course, it is this moment in time, if you're looking for a great Hollywood movie, it was here first. Okay, this is one of the most moving and passionate scenes in the Bible where Joseph throws out everyone, and then just it's him and his brothers, and he reveals himself to the brothers. And of course, they're in complete and total shock. And of course, his first question is, how is my father? Is he alive? Of course, he knows he's alive, because we just had this whole sob story from Judah about the tremendous pain. And yet by saying, is my father alive? He was basically just trying to say, this is what I care about most. I want to ensure that he's alive. I want to see my father. I want to make sure we are reunited as quickly as possible. Okay. Now let's go on and see how this idea of Judah's leadership within the family, him stepping up, and not only that he has taken this responsibility, assuming the responsibility as a leader of the family, but how that indeed is recognized further by Jacob. So initially we see it recognized by Jacob in a fairly subtle way. In chapter 49, towards the very end of, not chapter 49, chapter 46, chapter 46, when we see the procession, when we see Jacob going down to Egypt, and they arrive in Egypt, verse 28. And he had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to point the way before him to Goshen. Okay? This is Jacob now, as they're approaching Egypt, selects Judah to be the one to go ahead and make the arrangements.
Yeah.
Okay? So until now, we saw Judah stepping up on his own account. But through this little subtle beginning of the verse, the fact that, Jacob, he has all these sons, and by the time they arrive in Egypt, he has his sons, he has his daughter, he has his grandchildren, he has, a whole family there, and yet he chooses Judah to go ahead.
Yeah.
So this is an indication that he has assumed this position in his family. And then, of course, at the end of in next week's Torah portion, but I'm going to sneak ahead because it's okay to follow on this one note. In chapter 49, verses 8 to 10. Of course, chapter 49 is all the blessings that Jacob blesses his children before he dies. And these blessings are actually a combination of his own personal perspective on his children, as well as some prophetic content that he talks about what will happen to them. In fact, he says, the way he opens verse 1 in chapter 29, he says, come together that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come. So he himself is aware that he is sharing with them a prophetic vision for each of them, but at the same time, he's also reflecting on how he sees them. And I'll give you an example for that. And at the beginning of his blessings, when he talks to Reuben, he talks to me about he's not stable, he's rash, and he rebukes him for something he had done. And he also similarly rebukes Simeon and Levi for what they have done in the whole issue of Shechem. So it's not just prophetic, it is also, this is how I see you guys, for good or for bad. And when it comes to Judah, it is clear that here too, he sees Judah not only as a leader of his brothers, but as the future leader of Israel. So let's see what he writes. You, O Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. So first we see that we have a couple of things here. First of all, that the brothers shall praise him, or they shall thank him. So that Judah is recognized within the family as one that stands out, and all the brothers seem to share that acknowledgement of Judah as the leader. But yet it also talks about how Judah stands between the family and any enemies. And this, of course, looks more to what will happen in the future, that Judah will be there and he will be able to defeat his enemies. And then we go back to the family. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. The sons will not only praise you, but the sons will succumb to you, will honor and recognize your leadership. Then another very important part of this is verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor ruler's staff from between his feet, until... Now here we have a problem of how we're going to translate this. I will translate this literally, until he comes to Shiloh, and the homage of peoples will be his, or the homage of nations will be his. Now, why do I pause with Shiloh? Because there are two different traditions here as to what Shiloh is, based upon how it is spelled. One of the spellings is Shiloh as in the place Shiloh, and one is Shiloh spelled in a way that you really don't know what the word is, but some have interpreted to mean in parallel to the homage of the second half of that sentence. It can be translated in a similar way, homage or a gift or an honor. An honor will come to him, okay? Or he will come into honor, or the people will honor him. So if I, just kind of break that down, what it is that we're talking about. So first of all, the scepter shall not depart from Judah has definitely been interpreted to be a reference to the house of David. Once David becomes king, and he of course is from the tribe of Judah, from that point on, and this is something that God promises to David, that the kingship of Israel will always be in the house of David. And we see that, of course, David then hands it to his son Solomon. And then the kings of Judah remain always, always, always from the house of David. That does not change. Unfortunately, after Solomon's death, the kingdom splits. We'll discuss that briefly soon. But we have this idea, and even in our tradition, and I know it's a Christian tradition as well, that Messiah himself will be a descendant of David, will be from the tribe of Judah. Okay? So there are people who interpret Shiloh as being some sort of reference to Messiah. Up until Messiah comes, or even until Messiah comes, the leadership of Israel will be in the hands of Judah. Okay? Another interpretation of this verse, though, is a less promising one, and interprets it as follows. The scepter or whatever, the staff will not depart from you until you get to Shiloh. And here the reference is that Shiloh, which is in the territory of Ephraim, okay, that until the kingdom splits, because after Solomon's death, the kingdom splits, and actually the kingdom splits in Shechem, which is not far from Shiloh, but it's both of them in the tribe of Ephraim. And at that point in time, the kingdom splits by one kingdom, the kingdom of Judea, which is led by Judah, and the northern kingdom, which is led by Ephraim, which is the son of Joseph. Okay, so this verse is saying, yes, you will always be the leader until you have a problem with the northern kingdom and the tribe of Ephraim. But in any case, no matter how you cut it, there's no question here that Judah is set forth as the leader of the nation. Okay, now, I just want to, it's just to refer briefly to this issue of the split of the kingdom. We talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about Joseph, okay? What we saw here at the beginning of the Torah portion is Judah approaching Joseph. And you look at these two people, these two individual brothers, one against the other. That sort of portends that later on, when the nation is no longer together and when they are divided, it will bring those same two brothers up against each other. The rival for Judah will always be Ephraim, will always come from the house of Joseph. And I will add to that there is a tradition in Judaism. It's not a unanimous tradition, but it's a tradition that exists that there will be actually two Messiahs. One is from the house of Joseph and one from the house of Judah, but not as fighting, not as competing with one another, but as two different stages. Messiah, son of Joseph, is more the one who's leading the battles, and it is Messiah, son of David, who is the ultimate Messiah who will usher in peace and be the real leader. So the final division recognizes the leadership of both of these tribes, but always puts Judah on top. Okay. Now I just want to I know we don't have that much time, but I just want to add a few more pointers that we see in this Torah portion. Joseph, towards the end of the chapter, to the end of the Torah portion, in chapter, after the brothers come down, after they're all settled, one of the things we see is that, and this is in chapter 48. Is it 48? No, not 48. 47, chapter 47, very interesting chapter. It's an economical chapter, okay? What it tells us is how Joseph, in other words, initially he planned for the famine, he did all kinds of things, but he took that a lot further. And essentially what he did as part of his economic plan was he nationalized all of Egypt. No more personal property. What he basically did is had all the property of Egypt become under the crown. Pharaoh, everything for Pharaoh. And I think it's a very ironic thing because what he essentially does is he sets the stage for the slavery. It is only because Pharaoh ends up owning all of Egypt, all of the land, that he can impose slavery on the entire land. Because otherwise it would have been every individual. Do I want a slave or don't want a slave? But it's very clear that the nation of Israel are slaves to Egypt, to the crown, and they are working all over Egypt. And the whole country is cooperating because Pharaoh owns the whole country. And who set the stage for that? Joseph himself. And it's interesting because you see that kind of situation. Joseph, again, one of Israel, but totally dedicated to helping Pharaoh and helping the leader of the land. But he, without realizing it, sets the stage for something terrible that will happen to his people. I want to point out one other thing is that just before Jacob goes down to Egypt, we see that he's very, very concerned. Chapter 46, at the beginning, as he's leaving, God says to Israel in the dream of the night, it says, Jacob says, I am here. He says, I am the Lord. I am God, Lord of your father. Fear not, go down to Egypt, for I will make you there into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Of course, if God says to somebody, don't fear, it means they're afraid. Mm-hmm. Why is Jacob afraid? Remember the covenant of the pieces. Remember God's prophecy to Abraham hundreds of years earlier in Genesis chapter 15. You should know that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end, they shall go free with great wealth. This is the promise that has been handed down to the generations, and Jacob knows, and as he's leaving down to Egypt with his entire family, he has to know, or at least suspect, that this is where it all begins. And so he's frightened. And God doesn't dispel the fear of enslavement. He doesn't mention enslavement. All he says was, don't fear, I will be with you, and I will ensure you come back. And indeed, Joseph is there when he dies. And indeed, Jacob is brought back to the land of Israel, and he's buried in Hebron. But God does not contradict the slavery. But what he says to Jacob is, don't fear, because I will be with you. And I think in this scene, as Jacob is going down to Egypt, we see the promise and the fulfillment of this promise, the original promise from Abraham that is passed on. God is now about to begin the fulfillment of that promise, or that threat, or whatever you want to call it, to Jacob and his children. And of course, the way all that pans out is something we will deal with when we start reading the book of Exodus. But I think in this Torah portion, the next Torah portion is the very end of Genesis. Things just kind of recap, and we'll discuss that next week. But in this going down, we see really the recap, the closing of the circle from God's first speaking to Abraham to what is happening right now to Jacob and his children. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Awesome. Toda rabah.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat
Wonderful
Shalom.
teaching, Sondra. Wonderful teaching.
Thank you. Thank you.
Starting a lovely time. Wonderful.
Thank you.
God bless.
Okay, Lamb. Oh, she's so lovely.